The Battle for Moriah. Chapter 5. The next morning when Tobias woke up, the negative emotions from the previous day had subsided. He had already forgiven Sarah for any hurt he suffered from her, and resolved to be better, although it was unclear to him how he should go about actually being better. He felt refreshed and hopeful, like life had a kind of sweetness to it. Whatever its source, the mood inspired him to go outside and go fishing. Once out on the water, the feeling persisted. Huge rolling clouds towered overhead, but the sun shone through, not yet high enough to be obscured. Birds sang and fish leaped, and there was no sign of other human activity. It must have been very early indeed. Surrounding the lake were low hills covered in ancient forest. On one side the hills dropped straight as cliffs into the water. Here the water was deep, and the children loved to jump from the cliffs into the lake. And there was a spring near the top of the cliffs, and this fed the lake with fresh white water. The lake itself was a deep blue-green, earning it the name Emerald Lake, although it was really the color of aquamarine. The beauty was such that there were many myths about the place, of wood sprites and fairies, and apparently the Fountain of Youth, though Tobias imagined that if such a thing existed, he would likely have known some people who appeared very young and very unhappy. The idea of living forever had never much appealed to him, at least not in this passing world. And yet this lake was likely the closest thing to paradise he had ever known. Perhaps it was the age of the trees, perhaps the brightness of the sun, perhaps the luxury of the water, but Tobias felt the sensation of sweetness grow, and thought that maybe he had indeed found the legendary fountain. Tobias did not engage long in entertaining myths in his mind. He began to think of Sarah, whom he had somehow hurt the day before. He was not sure what the source of her irritability was, but surely it was more than the silly conversation of some simple townspeople. Tobias saw her point, of course. It was naive to believe in things which no one had ever seen evidence for. Though the stories of dragons were told with much more solemnity than those of the Fountain of Youth, this did not necessarily add to their credence. For what if people swore altogether that they had seen and even battled these creatures? Most of these people were old. Their stories could have grown and evolved over the years. What then had offended Sarah? She was normally so even-tempered, patient, delightful even. As he thought about her, he realized how much he loved her, and decided that the thing to do would be to show her. He would pull in his nets and go home and bathe first, hopefully purging the smell of fish from himself as much as possible. Then he would pack some sort of a picnic. It would have to be bread, cheese, and wine, because he had nothing else. He'd pick for her some lilacs and make a comparison between her and the flowers. He'd then call on her in the castle and take her to the meadow, and there tell her of how beautiful and wonderful she was. He would even write a poem. Surely that couldn't take too long. He brought his boat in at the little dock near his cottage. But to his surprise, Sarah was sitting on a chair under the overhang by the front door. She was waiting for him, and smiling. He realized too late that he would not be able to bathe before seeing her, that he was covered in fish smell and sweat from the work of bringing in his labor. Moreover, he needed to tend to his fish right away so they would not spoil. The fish were by this time dead. While he sat in his boat considering what course of action to take, he panicked when he saw her walking towards him on the dock. He quickly cast his nets back overboard, but to his dismay, most of the fish fell out and sunk to the bottom of the lake. And now she was beside the boat. "Hello," she said, and smiled. She had done up her hair, which normally she wore loose with a simple ribbon for adornment, so that now it was a complicated mass of curls and pearls on top of her head. She wore a strong perfume that he did not care for, something rich and exotic, no doubt, and even her dress was somehow severe, though she tried to wear it in a feminine nature, making the whole thing rather awkward. "Hello," he replied, breathless, and gave her a sort of a hug that lacked in intimacy in order to protect her severe dress from his fishy smell. She hugged him back as though it were a formality. "How are you, Pomegranate?" he asked her, trying to seem natural. Pomegranate had been a nickname of hers from her father, and Tobias borrowed it on occasion, though he had no idea why her father used it in the first place. "I'm really good now that I'm with you," she said, smiling again, and kissed him on the cheek. "I brought you some lunch." She gestured toward a picnic basket resting beside the door of the cottage, near where she had sat. Upon investigation, it revealed many rich and foreign delicacies, including quail and duck and boiled eggs, a hard black bread, and a gray paste that he could not identify. And for dessert, a type of pastry containing dates. "Why don't you go wash up, and I will set the table and we'll eat?" "Well, I was just thinking how nice it would be if you and I were to share a picnic in the meadow." "Oh, not the meadow. The sun is so harsh, and I didn't bring a hat. Besides, there'd be all kinds of insects and wind. No, let's eat in your little cottage. While you're washing your hands, I'll set the table and open the windows to air the place out." And with that, she took the food into the cottage and got to work preparing the place for a meal. His bed was unmade, but she quickly fixed that. She took the dirty dishes and clutter which lay about and put it all in a crate by the window, where he could wash it all later. She opened the windows to let out the stale, musty air that filled the place. The cottage had only one room, and smelt of sleep, the kind of sleep that working men have, not princesses, who of course produce no odor at all. She found dishes which nearly matched, and what could pass as cutlery. The small wood table was barely big enough for a proper place setting, but that could be remedied after they were married. After all, the little table and funny wooden chairs, the awful bed, all of this would be replaced. She would show him how to live like a prince. She knew it would take some work, but she was up to the task. And she had demonstrated that she was not afraid of a little work, though entirely accustomed to having had it done for her by her maids and servants. She could take the grimy little home of this clumsy man and turn it into something, well, at least somewhat less grimy. Tobias washed as he had been instructed and came inside. He saw that Sarah was bustling about and that there was nothing he could do. In fact, it was unclear to him what precisely she was doing, but whatever it was apparently made the whole place much more satisfactory. She set out the dishes on the table and sat across from him, still stiff and rigid in her dress. Tobias realized immediately that he was slouching, and corrected it. Slouching is no posture for a prince. "Tobias, dear, why don't you lead us in grace?" Sarah said. Tobias, after all, was the man of the household, and it was for him to lead. Then Sarah served them both food. Sarah said, "Tobias, do you have any butter?" He hadn't, and she was quite disappointed, but she said, "Oh, well, of course not. You don't even have a cow. I should have known to have brought some. I'm so foolish sometimes." Then she smiled so sweetly that he had to smile back. Of course, he protested that she was not a fool, that naturally he should have had some butter in the house, and he would try to have some for next time. "Thank you," she said. "You're so good to me. After all, this meal just isn't quite the same without butter, you know?" He didn't know, but nodded. The food was incredible, and he found that he was hungry. He quickly ate what was on his plate, and then waited. She was not finished her first serving yet, and though he couldn't be quite certain, he felt that it would likely be impolite to get a second helping in the presence of a princess who was having her first. When she finished, she immediately said, "And now for dessert," and began serving the date pastry. And so Tobias never did have his second serving, but began the pastry instead. He got crumbs on his pants, which he was not concerned about until she said, "That's okay, dear. Just take a napkin and clean yourself off." Once the meal was completed, Sarah took all of the leftover food and dumped it into the dirt outside. "The garden will be better fertilized this way," she explained. "I see that you have not had much luck in growing anything." "I hadn't really been trying to," Tobias began. "Oh, I know, you're not a gardener. No need to apologize. I just wanted to give you this chance to improve yourself." "Yes, well, thank you," Tobias said. He could not have explained it, but it seemed to him that he was some sort of a spectator who was doing a rather poor job at spectating. Sarah gathered the now empty dishes back into her basket and said, "I wouldn't want to add to the dishes that you already have to do once I am gone. I'll bring these back to the castle for the scullery maids to do. But I'd better go. There is all kinds of business to attend to back at the castle, you know, and father wouldn't have me socializing all day. Goodbye." And with that she started towards the door. Tobias rose quickly and held the door for her as she left. "Goodbye," he said. "I love you." "And I love you," she said, tapping her finger on his nose. And she left. Chapter 6. Sarah left that day feeling satisfied. She had made herself beautiful for him, and he had responded precisely as she wanted. It was too bad, of course, that so much response was needed. Too bad that her father hadn't chosen for her a better man, a more princely man, someone with a palace, or at least who knew how to live in one. But she was engaged to Tobias, and she did in fact love him. And she knew now that she could change him, and this she was determined to do, however long it took. Each night the dragon came for her again. Each night she met him in the dark garden, and in time her fear diminished. She also realized that she barely cared if they were seen. There was no mad raking or trying to hide the evidence. Something told her that this last change was imprudent. She must maintain that guard, but she did so without enthusiasm. The dragon flew with her and educated her. This continued for many nights, and he showed her many things she had never known. She began to pity her father, who was so afraid and so simple, and she began to resent him for using his power to impose his simplicity on others. Her mother may be silly and frivolous, but perhaps she could be persuaded to see this. Most of all, she began to dislike Tobias. He was a hindrance for her. If she married him, he would one day be king, and the cycle of ignorance would be perpetuated as another silly fool was given the power. Of course, she as queen would have the power to make Tobias do as she wished. But then, if there was no Tobias, then she would have absolute power in the kingdom, and no need to persuade him of anything. Tobias, she found, was becoming increasingly plotting. He continued to serve her and honor her, as she knew he would. Tobias, after all, was weak, a male set to be deceived by beauty. She did not think of it as deception. If the man could not be enlightened by reason, then at least he could be trained to function like one who was enlightened. Sarah spent less and less time eating with her family. Each evening at dinner time, her father himself would come to her and ask her to come to dinner, but she would refuse. She would generally claim to be tired or feeling sick, which was true enough since she spent the bulk of her nights riding with Molech. She found that the company of her parents bored her. They would talk happily about the beauty of a sunset or the wonderful townspeople, not the riveting wisdom she heard from Molech. Miriam would laugh and admire, and Melchizedek would joke and extol, but Sarah always found that she was not a part of it any more, and she did not want to be. She did not admire the townspeople. She did not find her father's simple, unprovocative humor funny. Even sunsets had lost their appeal since they were a simple pleasure, and who had time to admire sunsets when all of these victims of her father's silliness were in dry and ugly places? One night, Molech took her out beyond the mountain ranges, further than he had ever taken her. She realized that they were getting quite far from the castle. In fact, they were beyond the borders of the country now. Moreover, she would not likely make it back before sunrise. "Where are you taking me?" "To war," Molech said. "The others are gathered together even now in council. I have told them about our conversations, and it is agreed by all that you would be invaluable on our side." "I don't know what you mean. If I can be of any help in persuading my father, I would gladly do so." "Your father is beyond persuasion. He's absolutely convinced that he is right, and perfectly right. This arrogance is inevitably his downfall. Logic holds that if one person is absolutely right, then all others who differ from that one must be wrong, or at least only right in part. A man like that cannot be reckoned with." "Then what is your plan?" Sarah asked. "I told you, it is war. How the battle will be fought is yet to be determined. You will be key in this. But the end is certain. Your father will be overthrown. The castle will be destroyed. The weak and the ignorant will be eradicated. And finally, the kingdom will be established in the manner we have long known it should be. Sarah began to feel afraid, and in particular to fear the dragon. For the first time in many nights she remembered the danger she was in, both from the beast and the external threats. Yet she found herself trapped. She dared not contradict the dragon. Suddenly his scaly back and bat-like wings were repulsive to her, and she feared their power. She wished Tobias were with her, or better yet, her father. Sarah spoke. "What will become of them? I mean, my father, the king." Molech was silent, but Sarah suddenly understood. "Take me home," she ordered. "You are in no position to give commands," the dragon said. "In a few moments we will be landing amongst those banished by your father. They want you dead, and for good reason. I will protect you, provided you cooperate. Now, be silent." Though he did not sound angry, there is a menace in his voice, and she realized that she was a prisoner. Tobias woke early that morning. He had not slept well, and uneasy tension was on him. He had not spoken to Sarah in many days. He knew that he needed to travel to the castle and see her, and hopefully this time they'd be able to have a more genuine conversation. He felt insecure. He kept dodging the thought that perhaps she no longer loved him, or that she just found him tedious and juvenile. He suspected that if they could only spend some quality time together, he would discover that all of these tensions in their relationship had just been the product of his own overactive imagination. But as he passed through the village, he noticed something strange. Many of the homes and shops were closed, with even the window shutters shut and curtains drawn. There was not the usual business about the village. People walked hurriedly and nervously. He noticed, too, it was almost all men. Where were the women? Where were the children? Men watched the sky as they walked, ducking and wary. They stayed close to the shops. Some gathered in small groups and consulted with one another, but they did not stay in one spot long. Some looked at Tobias for a moment, but none made eye contact. Neither did any greet him. In the town square, Tobias saw Eli, the king's herald, walking hurriedly. Eli usually carried himself with an air of importance, not puffed up, but with an awareness that he worked for the king, and he therefore had a dignity by association. But today he looked frightened, uncertain. He walked as though he very much needed to get somewhere, but wasn't sure himself where that somewhere might be. "What's the news, Eli? Why does everyone seem so nervous?" Eli looked at Tobias. "Have you not heard? The king has ordered all the soldiers and guards to report to the castle. It seems there is an imminent threat." "Threat? From who?" Eli came close, took Tobias by the arm, and brought him under the awning of the bakery. "Dragons!" he whispered, almost as though the word itself might bring with it the peril it indicated. "Do you remember the one that was seen over the village last week?" "I thought that was just a story, or—" "The king believes now that one may have been a scout. Another one landed last night, in the castle's interior garden. No one saw it, but it left its odor and claw marks. Moreover, the gardener had been noticing strange happenings in the garden for some time, and believes that this may not have been the first time it landed." Tobias wondered how seriously he should take this apparent threat, indicated only by strange smells and markings. Again, he'd never seen a dragon himself, and he had no reason to believe they existed, except the old stories. However, he gave Eli the benefit of the doubt. Tobias spoke. "Well, perhaps I should not go to the palace today, then, as the king will be occupied with knights and soldiers. But it would be good to see Sarah." Eli looked him in the eye. "Tobias, I hate to be the one to tell you this. Sarah is missing. She's not been seen since last evening, when she went to bed early because she was not feeling well. It was our hope that she was with you, or perhaps in the village somewhere." Then Eli said, "Tobias, the garden with the dragon marks was Sarah's interior garden." Tobias's heart sank. "Do you think the dragon took her?" "We don't know. She's missing. Some say she may have gone willingly." Tobias felt dizzy. "She wouldn't," he said, prompted by chivalry to defend her honor. "But Hadn't she been acting strangely? "I must speak with the king," he said, as he turned, and now began to run up the hill towards the castle. When he arrived, he found the castle heavily guarded with men on either side of the gate and more on the walls. Reuben, the head guard, saw him coming. "Let him pass," he ordered. Reuben himself escorted Tobias into the throne room. Inside, General Joab was addressing the king. "Your Majesty, every citizen must be brought into the castle walls immediately until we ascertain the level of the threat towards our people." Another of the king's advisors, a man named Solomon, interrupted. "To pull the citizens in now, when attack is not imminent, might only cause panic. And besides, there will be looting." "The people are already panicking," the general argued. "Every business is closed. They are afraid to leave their homes." Reuben spoke up. "Your Majesty, Tobias is here." All eyes were on the king. Melchizedek said, "Joab, I entrust to you the task of bringing every citizen into the castle. I believe we have 3 or 4 days before we will be attacked. However, we must be prepared at any moment. Bring all the foods and weapons into the fortress walls, and redirect the spring so the water comes in through Hezekiah's tunnel. If there is going to be a siege, we should be able to withstand it for several months, if necessary." Hezekiah was one of the ancient kings who in his own time had withstood a siege by building a tunnel to bring water under the castle walls. Joab and the others immediately set to work. Reuben returned to his post. Melchizedek stood and gestured for Tobias to follow him into another room. It was a smaller, more comfortable one reserved for members of the royal family. It was adjoined by the private chapel where Tobias could see through the glass doors that Queen Miriam was praying. The guards left them to have a private conversation, for which Tobias was thankful. "Tobias, it is good that you are here," said Melchizedek. "They have taken my daughter, and I know not where, and we expect that they are intent on destroying the whole village." "But, Your Highness, Eli told me that Sarah was missing. How can you be certain that she was taken?" "Even Eli does not know all of the details. I asked him to search for her, it's true, but she's not in the village. We have decided that until we have a plan to address this crisis, it is best that the people do not know all of the details. Come into the garden." The king stood and led the way from the room into the garden. Tobias felt that he was somehow trespassing. He knew about the garden, but he had never seen it. Sarah was supposed to bring him there herself as part of a marriage ritual, but now a dragon had been there first. Evidence for the dragon was something more than Eli had let on. Tobias realized that, of course, the king would not have allowed the herald into the garden. It was the special place where only Sarah and the gardener were ever permitted to be. But now, it was as though the dragon had deliberately damaged the garden. Flowers were trampled, grass which had been perfectly manicured had been scratched and dug up by the dragon's claws, and there was a particular odor like seaweed or fish or something that accompanied that smell was that of burnt wood. In the center of the garden stood the old willow tree, where Sarah had often spoke of resting under its branches and reading or praying, or just being alone and listening to the birds. It had been burnt. Even now, though it appeared that the fire had long since been extinguished, it continued to spew smoke into the air. "It will likely have to be chopped right down. It is still smoldering on the inside," Melchizedek said. "As you can see, the dragon did considerable damage. It is our hope that Sarah did not see this before she was taken." Do you think she's alive?" Tobias forced himself to ask. Melchizedek nodded his head somberly. "Yes, she is alive. Dragons are very dangerous, but their greatest danger lies in their ability to persuade and to confuse. He likely would have convinced her to come out to him before he snatched her away." He went on, "Understand, my son, that the dragons will try to turn her against us and so to use her as a tool. They do not eat humans, at least not for the pleasure of the eating. They do sometimes for revenge or for the pleasure of striking fear or suffering into humans. Sarah would be quite valuable to them. They know that I love her so much that I would give them myself to have her back. But I don't believe they are looking for a simple exchange. This has been tried in the past. I believe that taking Sarah is the first move in a great war." With that, Tobias and the king returned to the room where they had first begun the discussion. Upon entering the room, Queen Miriam joined them, sitting at the king's right hand. They sat together on a little couch, as any married couple that was in love would do. There was no pageantry or ritual. They were simply a man and a wife concerned with their daughter. Tobias saw too that Miriam had not been crying, as he would have expected. Her face showed sadness, but mingled with peace and joy, and hope. It was on this last thing that she spoke. "You are our hope, Tobias." "Me? What do you mean?" Melchizedek said. "I chose you, Tobias, to court my daughter. She chose you as her future husband. As her husband, you are her guardian and protector. I knew when I chose you that I had chosen well. Now it is time for you to rescue her." Tobias protested. "You mean to fight the dragon? But, sire, with all due respect, I'm only a fisherman. I'm not a knight. I don't know how to wield a sword or even to ride a horse. Why not send Joab or Reuben or any number of the knights you've gathered in the courtyard?" Melchizedek said, "My son, everyone has their roles to fulfill, but I have chosen you for this. You will need to trust me. I did not choose you because of your skill. When the time comes to do battle, you will know what to do. You are the one who must go right into the land of the dragons and rescue Sarah. Do not be afraid." Tobias sat stunned for a moment, looking first to the king, then to the queen, then back. Both looked at him intently with love and trust that he would accomplish the task. It was incredible to him. Surely there was no one in the world that the king loved more than his only daughter, Sarah. But somehow, Tobias felt all the objections in him fall away. If the king believed he could do it, then he believed he could as well. "Your Majesty," Tobias said, "I am your servant. I will do whatever you ask me to do." "Good," the king declared. "Very good. I'll give you my own horse, Rua, upon which to ride. He is a beautiful white stallion, strong and swift. He himself will know the way to find Sarah. Do not ask how." I do not know how to control a horse, much less—" "Good," the king said again. "It is better that way. Rua will be fast and certain, but you cannot control him. My advice to you is simple. Just hold on." "Yes, sire. Moreover, you will need armor. You must wear the full armor, breastplate and helmet and shoes and belt. Carry the double-edged sword and the shield." As he spoke, Melchizedek opened a small wardrobe on one side of the room. In it was a suit of armor gleaming and appearing to have been made of solid gold. It was unlike the armor which the other soldiers wore, and it was displayed as though it was to be seen, not worn. "This is the armor of Sir Michael, the great dragon slayer from of old." Tobias had heard of this great warrior, had seen the murals of him standing on the neck of a dragon with his sword drawn ready to kill. He was the greatest knight who had ever lived in the kingdom. And here was his armor. Presently the king was helping Tobias to put it on. It was heavy, but comfortable. The king put a shield in Tobias's left hand. The crest on the front was a crimson red with a gold cross in the middle. Then the king took a sword in its sheath and fastened it to Tobias's belt, so that it hung down by his left leg. "Draw your sword," the king commanded. Tobias did as he was ordered, and he was astounded to discover its lightness and with what ease he held it. It was weighted perfectly. Its handle was ornate, gold and crimson like his shield. The blade shone beautifully. Inscribed upon it were the words, "Truth conquers." "Always clean your sword after a battle before you return it to your sheath," the king instructed. "Yes, sir." "And now, there's one final piece of armor before you can go into battle. Miriam." The beautiful queen now stepped forward, looked Tobias up and down, and smiled. "You are a mighty knight," she said. Then she removed her mantle and draped it over his shoulders. It was a dark royal blue cape, decorated with golden stars irregularly spaced as they are in the night sky. "This is a gift from the king, which he gave me on our wedding day. It will protect you from the dragon if it attacks from behind. Never remove it." I won't, my lady." Miriam smiled and suddenly hugged Tobias, and she said, "I love you, my son." "Now," the king said, "you are ready for battle. You must be brave and prudent. Don't rush into danger unnecessarily, but let Rua guide you. I've given you everything you need in order to be victorious, and you will be victorious if you heed this warning. Do not speak to the dragon. His cunning is in his words. He will trap you by breaking your will, by telling you half-truths so that you do not even know what is right or wrong. He will try to do everything he can so that you drop your armor or leave your steed or submit to him. Battle him, but do not listen to him, or fall for the trap of entering into dialogue with him. Do you understand?" "Yes, your majesty." "Follow me." The king led his queen and Tobias into the throne room once again. He instructed his servants to bring all of the soldiers and the guards back into the throne room, even to abandon their posts on the walls and at the gates. This was done. Trumpets were sounded, and soon the throne room was very crowded. The king called for silence and declared, "Behold, here is our hope." The whole crowd roared their approval. The king said, "Now, my son, kneel." Tobias knelt before his king and queen, and Melchizedek knighted him.